Hey, Jake.
Hello. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too, and to all the listeners out there.
Yes, Happy New Year to all the listeners. We're going to get right into it. We're going to do what we never do on the show. We're going to start with sports.
Oh, yeah? I'm Andrew Tobias, by the way. Who are you?
I'm Jake Zuckerman.
Oh, and what are we doing here?
All right, let's this got all fucked. We can cut it and start somewhere new. Okay.
Yeah.
Happy New Year to esteemed listeners, esteemed flyers from Capitol Square. I am Jake Zuckerman.
I'm Andrew Tobias. And people always tell us to stick to sports, so that's what we're going to do today, right?
We're going to do it. It's the winning formula in media.
So, Jake, tell me what you remember about John Rocker.
Truth be told, nothing. This is a name I did not know of until about 2 days ago.
Yeah, and I'm like 10 years older than you, so this is, I think, where the generation divide really reveals itself. So I'll say I remember John Rocker for two things. One is that he gave an interview to the Sports Illustrated, which was a real magazine back then. It was important. It's hard to imagine unless you were there. But he said some objectionable things about the people of New York, and it didn't go over very well. And then the second thing that I remember him for is that he pitched for like 2 months for the Cleveland Indians during the 2001 season and did not really cover himself with glory. So
let's back up. When you say the people of New York, what people are we talking about?
Oh, well, just like pick a group. He was talking about how much he hated. I have the quote pulled up. I don't think I'm going to say it on the podcast, but
racial minorities, sexual minorities, etc.
Yeah, basically the kinds of people you might see on the subway, and he found it to be very upsetting that those kinds of people were surrounding him, basically. So, but I'm not surprised to learn that John Rocker since then has become a political commentator, which is just kind of funny in what it sort of says about the world of today versus the halcyon days of 1999 or what have you.
And this is an Ohio politics show, so why are we talking about John Rocker? Because John Rocker has been going to daycare centers in Ohio. He's been filming himself. He's carrying what I would describe as a baby doll that looks like it's supposed to be a non-white baby doll. John Rocker is a white man, and he has been going up to daycares, some owned by Somalian operators, some not, and he has been knocking on the door and insinuating in just a number of different ways that there are no children in the daycare facilities and that these are public benefit scams.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the substance of that in a little bit, but I think the reason why I flagged this, other than that it's just kind of strange, I think this kind of thing is probably gonna flare up more during this election cycle. Nick Fuentes, who is a white supremacist political commentator, he's got a pretty big following, has kind of called out Vivek Ramaswamy and said he's going to try to make an example of him in this race. So I'm just making a prediction. We're in the new year. I think that's going to make this election cycle extra weird. And I think that stuff like this is kind of like the tip of the iceberg, but we'll see.
Sure. And I think that especially it tends to come from the right, but there's always something that's racially loaded that happens to emerge in October before an election year. I'm thinking of the migrant caravan, quote unquote, of 2018. I'm thinking of the Springfield, the alleged Haitians eating cats and dogs of 2024. There's always one of these that just happens to drop at politically opportune moments.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say about this too, and this is loosely connected, but Vivek Ramaswamy wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week. Did you see that, Jake?
I did.
So he had kind of been teasing this for a bit, that he was using social media less. He was kind of questioning it. And he announced this week that he's completely deleted it from his phone and that he's basically swearing it off for personal reasons. And this is basically because of, if you look at his tweets, I've learned terms for Indian Americans and for Indians in general that I'd never heard before. It's just like a torrent of racism. It's just wild. And he concluded basically that, it was a waste of his time to really give too much credence to this stuff. And I think that's interesting because what I've seen from, there's a whole bunch of facets to this, but from conservative politicians the last 5 years, including Ramaswamy, is that they've been kind of using social media as a heat map to say hey, this is the thing I need to drive into and make a big deal out of, which I think explains why people like John Rocker suddenly descended on Columbus, for example. I mean, it's like a... it's an attention-seeking strategy that is basically the current media environment. So it's interesting to see Ramaswamy kind of, swear the whole thing off. And I just, like I said, I imagine we're probably going to be seeing more of this stuff before this election is over.
Well, let's give a skeleton to this bag of bones a little bit. So John Rocker was knocking on doors of daycares. If you follow American politics, you might know that there's a significant public benefits fraud scandal going on in Minnesota. There are publicly funded daycares who, according to both media reports and a pretty sprawling prosecution, I believe it's a federal prosecution, I think there are 78 people who have been arrested and 57 convicted. That's according to the Cato Institute. And the long story short is they are claiming enrollment in these daycares and meals going to these kids, and the kids don't exist. So it's just your classic public benefits fraud. The hook here is that many, but not all of these operators are Somalian, and there has been this general political effort to speculate that, well, if there's some kind of Somalian public benefits fraud happening in Minnesota, maybe perhaps it is happening here in Ohio, and that has led to John Rocker joining with different Republican figures, conservative figures in the Ohio media world and filming themselves knocking on these daycare doors in Ohio without any serious evidence of fraud or of any sort of enrollment monkey business, and just sort of knocking and demanding entrance and demanding to inspect the children. As you can imagine, no reasonable daycare will allow strange adults in to inspect the children, and these scenes lead to very predictable clashes.
Yeah, so that's a natural transition into our first segment today. Mike DeWine had a press conference about this subject this week, so we kind of explained the background. What did he say, Jake?
Well, I think I got two general messages from his press conference. For one, if you are an adult, you may not go to a daycare, and a daycare may not admit you. I mean, if for anyone who has children can understand.
I've got kids in daycare. There's a lock. You have to have a reason to be there to get in there, and that's the way that I would obviously prefer it, to make sure my kids are safe.
Sure, but more saliently than that, what I think the governor really wanted to say is, I mean, for one, he demonstrated how Ohio combats fraud with its publicly funded daycares. I have no children. I didn't know this, but there is a iPad system to sign in. You type in your phone number. Each phone number has a unique PIN. The providers currently do not and should not have access to that PIN. Once you enter that PIN to sign in and sign out, there's a photo that is taken. That photo must capture a guardian that's known and can take this child to and from, whether that's a parent or a babysitter. And there are unannounced audits of these facilities. So it's like other, sometimes when these fraud allegations kick up around voting, it's typically true that there is some fraud. There are bad actors who will try to defraud a system, but there are controls in place to prevent that and to catch it on the back end. And the governor's message is there's no reason to suspect fraud here. I think he said unfair. I think unfair was his word, that it is unfair to say that one racial group is perpetuating a fraud somewhere else, and therefore other members of that same racial minority are perhaps perpetuating that fraud here, and stop going to our daycares.
Yeah, I did some stories about 15 years ago about the idea of there being fraud in this system. It's been so long and I still haven't reread my story, so I forget what conclusions I actually drew from that time. The thing that was most memorable to me was that me and my team of reporters figured out a childcare center that looked like it was billing the government for a lot of kids. So we decided to park our car across the street from this random house in a Dayton suburb. And eventually they called the police on one of us. It wasn't me. They asked what we were doing there. It was fine. But then we basically gave up the whole idea about the stakeout at that point, and thinking that we were going to get the old school smoking gun video or something like that. So that's, the takeaway that I had from that is that there is fraud that exists in this system, just like any government program. And if you try to investigate it, you're probably going to make people really suspicious, which is kind of what happened, in some of the cases that we saw this week.
Sure.
But it's not really about fraud though, right? I mean, it's that's sort of ostensibly what the story is about. But what's happening underneath the surface, do you think?
I think there are two things. I think that the racial issues and the xenophobia issues are just really unavoidable. I mean, it's actually pretty outrageous on its face, is the way I described it earlier, is to just our system of justice is individual. If you commit a fraud, you go to jail. Other members of your race or your national background don't go to jail. That's outrageous. And there's also this bit, I mean, you could call it misinformation. I might quibble with the term, but clearly people have bought into this idea. I think it has really gained a lot of traction that there's this fraud problem and that it is with the Somalians in Columbus. And what was really interesting about what the governor was saying is he was really studiously fact-checking it and trying to get the truth out there. And he said that, that's why I've called the media here today. I want you all to tell the truth and make sure people know. But Governor DeWine did not want to address why do people believe this bad information. And it's hard to say why anyone believes anything, but the fact is that there are very senior Republicans, people who have the trust of voters, who have won the trust of voters and won statewide races. Some names would include Ken Blackwell as Secretary of State, State Auditor Keith Faber, Josh Williams, a state representative who's running for Congress now, who in most cases they stop short of claiming the outright existence of fraud, although Ken Blackwell did do that. But they're sort of suggesting that there might be fraud.
Yeah, they basically see this story blowing up and they want to seem like they're being responsive to it to their voters.
Yes. In Keith Faber's instance, who's the state auditor, now he's running for attorney general, he said there's public interest in there. The public seems to think there might be fraud, so I'm going to announce an audit, and if you have information, come to me, which is not an accusation of fraud per se, but it sure puts it out there when you put that into a newspaper headline. And Governor DeWine just didn't want to go there. He just did. He even used language similar to that of like, look, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get into why people think there might be fraud. I'm just here to say what the facts are.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of the longer he's governor, the more he'll just be like, yeah, I'm not going to answer that question instead of dancing around it. At least he gets to the point.
Mm-hmm. And I had a chance to ask the governor because, well, as I said to him, the last time I remember him coming out and really saying like, you know what, this crap is not true, and even suggesting that there's a bit of racism, a racist undertone, was the Haitian situation where I mentioned where, Haiti, it's a country that's close to the governor. They have a big population in Springfield, which is near where the governor lives. And there were these outrageous and frankly just racist claims that these Haitians are eating cats and dogs. They were wildly unverified and often embarrassingly debunked. And the governor penned an op-ed in the New York Times and called out Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, which is something that Governor DeWine very rarely does, as the purveyors of this misinformation. I got a chance to ask the governor, the two times you've done this in my recollection are these two instances where these racial minority subgroups are sort of getting beat up on by the political right. Do you see any connection between the two of them? And once again, I got look, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, so I think there's going to be more of these kinds of things, and it's always just worth watching, like how our leaders respond to them, and both what they say and what they do. So yeah, let's tie this off. But like, what do you think about how DeWine handled this?
The title we used in our newsletter was that Mike DeWine is putting out fires but ignoring the arsonist, and I think that this stuff has to stop at the source. It will be really, really difficult to sort of just ignore the fact that this stuff comes from somewhere. These aren't immaculately conceived ideas. They come from political elites, and I think it rolls downhill. And if you're unwilling to address that, you will not be able to seriously stop the tide of this misinformation.
All right. Well, let's make a natural transition to our next subject. Right.
Out with the old and in with the new. Mike DeWine is the old, as in his term is ending. That is not a statement about his age. In with the new, we have a governor's race this year, and those two gubernatorial candidates just picked their LG running mates. Who are they?
So, yeah, that happened this week. On the Republican side, Vivek Ramaswamy picked Rob McColley, who, close watchers of Capitol Square happenings will know that McColley is the president of the Ohio Senate. It's like it's a title that doesn't really exist in other states, but he basically is the head Republican in the Ohio Senate. He decides what they vote on, like who gets what committee assignments, and he's had that job for a couple of years now. He's been in the legislature for about 10 years, and he is on the younger side. He's around 41, but he's an experienced Columbus legislator. On the Democrat side, Amy Acton picked David Pepper. I have to say, I was a little surprised to see David Pepper kind of reemerge in the active, in front of the, instead of behind the scenes, like, whatever. What's the opposite of behind the scenes? Like in front of the scenes?
Center
stage, yeah. I didn't do theater. That he has a center stage role again. He was the leader of the Ohio Democratic Party from around 2015 until through 2020. He ran for office in 2010 and 2014 and lost, including to Mike DeWine in one of those races. His dad was the CEO of Procter & Gamble for a while in the 90s, and as a result is wealthy, kind of well-connected in Cincinnati, well-connected in business. I mean, David's has an interesting background where he has a Yale law degree. He did some work in kind of like the post-Soviet Union Russia, kind of promoting, democratic, establishment, democratic institutions and stuff like that. He's been a novelist recently, writing kind of like political thrillers. He's a painter. I mean, he's kind of like this, I don't know, this man of many skills.
Well, tell us about the whiteboards.
Yeah, like people who might follow him on social media, he developed a following by getting up and like kind of, I wish we had a whiteboard, right? So maybe, I don't want to, I'm kind of envious that, he kind of stood around, he turned around and kind of like plotted out the political topic he was talking about in the background.
Think your crazy economics professor, just thinking he's making life clearer with this series of 18 graphs and Venn diagrams.
But yeah, so that's the ticket. And as far as kind of like why they picked them, Vivek was pretty clear that he basically said that he doesn't have any experience in government, that he has all of these ideas that he wants to put into place. And McColley is somebody that knows how things work in Columbus. I mean, he's, being the leader of the Senate, he's, knows who all of the special interests are and who their representatives are and what they want. He has relationships, among legislators, and he will know how to help Ramaswamy make his actual legislation get passed, because that's basically, there's only so much a governor can do without the legislature either enacting a new law or funding a new program or something like that. And then on the Democratic side, I talked to some Democrats about Pepper being involved. I mean, what Acton basically said was that she likes David, that he was advising her behind the scenes, that she believes that he's passionate about, the kinds of making policies that help people. That he's kind of showing her the ropes as she's also a first-time candidate and kind of learning about what that entails to get involved with politics. But also Pepper knows how to make phone calls and call up guys who maybe sat on the board of Disney with his dad, which is a real thing that was the case. He knows Bill Clinton, who wrote a kind of a blurb in one of his political novels, which is a pretty random fact. But he has the ability to kind of, I think, pick up the phone and raise money, which is something that that's something that a lieutenant governor can really help with, and that's something that she needs help with too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My takeaway from the two picks is that we're in the Trump era. No one's a politician. Everybody is not a politician. All politicians are not politicians. But so you have these two ostensibly outsiders who are on the top of the ticket. Vivek Ramaswamy never held an office. Amy Acton worked in state government briefly, but really is just a medical background. So you have the political insiders as the LGs and the outsiders at the top of the ticket. Just an interesting little trend.
Yeah. Do you think it matters who the lieutenant governor is, Jake?
I do not.
So I don't think it matters that much in terms of the vote. It does matter, I think, in the sense of who actually gets the office. We saw with John Husted, so just to kind of back things up for a second, the lieutenant governor really has no formal responsibility. But what we typically see is the governor will pick something to make the lieutenant governor, be their kind of thing to be in charge of. And so when DeWine was lieutenant governor in the early 1990s to George Voinovich back then, DeWine was put in charge of public safety. He's a former county prosecutor. There was this horrible prison riot in southern Ohio at that time, and DeWine was kind of like in charge of kind of dealing with it and being the face of how the state responded to that. So when DeWine became lieutenant governor, or when DeWine became governor, he made his lieutenant governor, John Husted, basically in charge of business stuff like economic development. He set up a new government agency that was basically like pet projects for John Husted about modernizing the government. So it is something that they can have a role. They advise the governor on how things go down. I think it makes a lot of sense to think of Rob McColley as kind of being like the legislative whisperer and kind of the one whose job it is to sell Republican legislators on the thing that they want to do. So that part matters. But as far as like the election itself, I would be, I'll just put it this way. Like John Husted is a sitting U.S. senator. He's running for election, and so now there's like polls about how many people know who he is and what they think about him. And of the like 5 or 6 statewide elected officials that were asked, he was by far the least known. And this is despite him holding a statewide elected office for the last 15 years, including a big stint as lieutenant governor. So these are not positions that normal Ohioans know about, that they think about. And it's kind of, it's kind of window dressing, even though it matters the reasons that we talked about a little bit.
This is almost beside the point, but I think that the name ID issue with John Husted is just an absolute indictment of the public and the amount we're paying attention
calling
to our
out the
state
voters.
Government.
That's
Yeah,
spicy, Jake.
That's on you, voters. That is not on John Husted. That is on you.
All right. Well, let's see let's just go on to thing number 3.
Yeah. Well, I've got a little pivot for us here on number 3. We've done the news. Now we're on to history, because Ohio made history today. We had the inaugural meeting after people have been waiting for months, years even for this. The Ohio Elections Integrity Committee, do I have their name right?
Close enough.
They're off the ground. We're at it. First, how did this form and why?
Yeah, and I'm going to be writing a story about this to kind of like basically bring into people why this matters. But so this agency was created by a law that got passed over the summer. It was part of the state budget, I believe. But we have had an entity in Ohio for a while that we've talked about in previous episodes called the Ohio Elections Commission. The job of that agency was to basically take allegations of campaign finance violations. So, Jake, you're running for office. You didn't file any paperwork saying like what money you raised. You put out an ad and lied about, where it came from. It used to be if the ad lied, the commission's job was to, basically determine if it was lying or not and order them to take it down. But they actually stopped doing that because basically there's a court ruling that said that lying is okay in politics. So, but
I would quibble with that analysis, but we can talk about that on another episode.
But yeah, so basically this old entity was responsible for policing campaign finance violations. And what happened was that they'd, if they made a case, they'd say, Jake Zuckerman, you failed to do all those things that I just said that you're supposed to do, and we're going to fine you $100,000. And so how you might respond is to not run for office and just never hear from you again. And you owe the state $100,000 forever. And then even kind of more commonly, you'd have political nonprofits get set up and then they'd get fined and then they'd fold and then there'd be like just nobody to collect at all. And so there are just millions and millions of dollars of outstanding fines that the Elections Commission has been unable to collect. There's been this giant backlog of cases. So the whole like uncollected fines thing is they actually close the case out, but in many cases they just haven't gone through the cases. I guess I don't want to like, draw out too much what the old Elections Commission wasn't doing, but lawmakers decided that it wasn't working, and they created this new Ohio Election Integrity Commission to try to basically reform it and start over from scratch.
That is correct. One thing I would add to the problems was that this operated like a court. There were hearings, there was evidence introduced. And most of the commissioners were not attorneys, which sounds like kind of an eye roll, but it really is a problem if you're trying to give people due process before they owe these big fines or to sort of just get the show moving. What are the rules of evidence, et cetera? You really want lawyers adjudicating something like that.
Yeah, the case that really ground my gears was after Larry Householder, the former Ohio House Speaker, was indicted in the House Bill 6 scandal, which is, people probably know about it. If not, they can look it up. There's an active ruling that you are not allowed to use your campaign money to pay for your criminal defense. And he basically just drained his campaign account and hired some lawyers. And the Elections Commission said that they were unable to investigate the case because Larry Householder wouldn't sit to be interviewed until the case was over. And so like it's kind of a catch-22. You're not allowed to do that, but we can't do anything about it until the trial is over. And so that years passed, like some of those cases basically like lapsed for, statute of limitations kind of things. So the new commission, I think one of the things that makes it different is that it's organized under the Ohio Secretary of State's office. In theory, this will kind of give it more of a purpose where you have somebody whose job it is to deal with election stuff, overseeing it. There's stuff written in the commission that these cases are going to be investigated by the Ohio Secretary of State's office. So they actually have a staff of people who can go and do investigations and look into some of these allegations here instead of just kind of like say that, the things that are available in the public record are inconclusive, which I go back to that Householder thing. He's basically, well, we can see that he reported paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to his lawyers, who are the same lawyers who are providing his criminal defense, but we can't conclude definitively that that's what he paid them for because we can't ask him. So they'll be able to proactively do a little bit of more looking at these things themselves. And, otherwise, LaRose said that he is going to make a priority out of collecting some of these uncollected things, figuring out what is uncollectible, trying to get some of the money. They also talked about potentially having this new agency enforce voting violations. So if somebody commits voter fraud or somebody's improperly registered, they don't have the ability to charge them, which that's a crime to do any of those things I just described, but they could fine them. So I'll be really interested to see what this agency actually does, because ultimately it's going to be political. The person who's in charge of it is going to decide, what cases to pursue. There's sort of like different people who appoint different members. There's 3 Republicans essentially based on the current construction and 2 Democrats. So it has some checks and balances built into it, but it'll be interesting to see what these things look like. And it's like as a nerd of state government, it is interesting actually to see a new government agency get born. Kind of being there on the first day, we could see it grow up now.
Like I said, history in the making, people. I think that's all we have today. I am Jake Zuckerman from Signal Flares in Capitol Square.
I'm Andrew Tobias.
Happy New Year, everyone.